So let's talk last, for the purpose of this lecture, about the Radical Reformation. So the Reformation unleashes this enormous wave of change and energy, and it unleashes things that the magisterial reformers themselves, who, by the way, didn't often agree among themselves, would not have, did not approve of, and would not have anticipated. And one wave of that is the Radical Reformation. I have up here a picture of Menno Simons. So Menno, right, that's Mennonites. There are other figures. Again, if you take church history with me, there's a number of these figures that we look at and some of their original texts that we look at. So notice kind of the period in which Menno Simons lives. And, the emphasis for the radical reformers is on personal individual discipleship, is on the normative status of Jesus' teachings. Notice that for Aquinas and Calvin and Luther and even Augustine, they're all, of course, going to talk about Jesus and Jesus' teachings and the Sermon on the Mount and all those sorts of things. But their sense of ethics is really, in many ways, more Pauline, more philosophical in a sense, or at least wrestling with philosophy in a sense. Whereas the Radical Reformation would say the fundamental root of our ethics is Jesus' teachings. And indeed, there's some way in which we can actually live up to Jesus' teachings. Luther would have said the Sermon on the Mount is really something that shows how we can't live up. But the radical reformers broadly would have said we actually can live up to Jesus' teachings. For many of the radical reformers, an emphasis on nonviolence, and this comes directly from Jesus' teachings. Luther and Calvin, being magisterial reformers, recognized the validity of the power of the sword, of the state's power of the sword and of war, and had various streams of thinking about war and just war and so on, really derived from the Augustinian tradition. And the Radical Reformation would go back and say, no, Christians should not be generally engaged in war. And also an emphasis on adult baptism. And I think in our evangelical branches of the church, this is something we don't really appreciate and take for granted in a sense when we're thinking about Christian ethics, and particularly when we're thinking about things like the relation between the church and state. Really prior to this period, the vast majority of Christian theologians accepted the validity and importance of infant baptism. Luther did, and also Calvin did. And certainly, Aquinas and Augustine did. And adult baptism and the entry into the church was also an entry into the broader society. And so infant baptism had many different important functions in the structuring of society. And for the radical reformers to come along and say, no, baptism is really given for adults who are making a conscious profession of faith, is not only a change in concepts about soteriology, it's also a concept, a mention about ecclesiology, and it's also a comment about political theology, about how the church relates to the state. Now probably most of us in evangelical traditions, the discipleship axis and the adult baptism axis, we've taken directly out of those movements. The extent to which we see Jesus' teachings as normative might vary, and most of us probably are not pacifists. Some of us may be today because of the re-emphasis on that theme in some contemporary theological ethics, but for the most part we haven't been.